Hello and welcome to this webinar. As I've said, my name is Fleur and I'm the Policy Consultant for Welfare at NUS. Today I'll be talking you through the Accommodation Costs Survey for 2015-16. I'm covering the following areas over the next sort of 30 to 40 minutes. I'll be looking at the methodology and the sample that we used for the Accommodation Cost Survey. I'll talk you through some of the key findings on rents and the profile of the sector. And I'll also go through some of the conclusions that the US came to on affordability and marketisation. And then finally, the recommendations that we made in response to the findings of the survey. So, first thing first, what is the Accommodation Cost Survey? It's a UK-wide survey of accommodation providers, so that's institutions and private providers of accommodation. We carry it out every 2 to 3 years. 2014 to 16 was the 33rd edition of this survey, so we've got data going back to around the 1960s for this survey. It's a unique longitudinal survey of student accommodation. The research seeks to understand things like the profile of the sector, trends in costs of accommodation, trends in contract types, regional variation and any reasons behind that regional variation, and then year-on-year trends that we can spot. The methodology that we use is an online survey that we submit to universities and private providers to capture data about their various provision, policies, and the way they use their purpose-built student accommodation. And we also sent out a workbook for them to give us some more detail about their rent portfolios for 2014 and 2016. The sample size for the research was really substantial, as it often is. At the moment, in 2015, there were approximately 508,000 spaces in the UK in purpose-built student accommodation. The Accommodation Cost Survey managed to reach 66% of that target population. It is statistically significant, and we're confident with the findings that we have with it. We've got the background and the methodology. Let's go on and talk about some of the interesting bits, the findings from the research. Starting with rents. What this slide shows is how rents have increased in just one academic year from 2014 on the left-hand side of the screen to 2015-16 on the right-hand of the screen. So what we see is that in the 2015-16 academic year, the overall average rents have increased by 4% since the previous year. They currently stand on average £147 per week. This is largely led by private provider growth and private providers, which now has an average weekly rent of £169, which is ostensibly 26% greater than institutional rent. So that nearly all of the rent rise that we're seeing year on year can be attributed to the private providers. When the annual cost of accommodation, which isn't shown on this slide, the average amount of rent paid by a student annually in 2014-15 was £5,909. By 2015-16, this had risen 5% to £6,201. Private providers are charging 41% more than institutions over the academic year, which again is attributing to a growth in the sector around 5%. So rents are going up, and that is being driven by private providers, but then also annual rents are growing as well, and that's being driven by private providers who have higher rents on average, but also private providers who have longer contract terms. So an average contract time for an institution was 41 weeks, but the average contract time for a private provider was 44 weeks. And students want a longer contract, and it's really useful for them to have that longer contract. But if you didn't want that longer contract, what that means is you're locked into paying a higher rent for a longer period of time, which is linked to these really high rates of annual rent. Slide showed us a little bit more detail about the regional averages that we can see in rent rises for weekly rent. And what we can see here is that in the east of England and in the southeast of England, we've actually seen a decline in rent. So the east of England has seen a 1% decrease, has seen a 9% decrease. But when you look at the rents being charged in those areas, they're actually comparative, if not more expensive, with the rest of the country. So it's not a sort of real-term decrease, it's that they got ahead of themselves in previous years and now they're just catching a little bit. The rest of the UK, we can see that rents have gone up. In Scotland, an 8% increase, the North East 9%. In Greater London specifically, that's a 13% increase on rent. So private rents in London, private accommodation rents in London gone up, but as have institutional rents in London as well. This slide is a little bit more detail about the regional variation in rents. This column that you can see sort of third along, that's Greater London. And what this really shows, if you look at the green bar, which is the private provider rents in London, you see that an average weekly rent in London from a private provider is £229, which is double some of the rents charged in other areas of the country. So London really are pulling ahead, pulling away, much more expensive, but this expense is really being driven by private providers, because if you look at institutions, their institutional rent is higher in London than it is across the UK. It isn't that much higher, it's the average which is being pulled up by private providers. Aspect of the rent profile is how much rent levels match against inflation levels. Inflation is used as a standard way to measure how much costs have increased in real terms compared with other expenses, like wages or the cost of commodities. So a product, and in this case the product is a room and accommodation, changed in its quality, we expect that it would be fair for the price of that product to only increase in line with inflation. However, this slide tracks how the cost of accommodation has matched against inflation, and you can see that except for 2013, rents have consistently risen above inflation. What we noticed about 2013 is it wasn't that all of a sudden providers thought, oh, we've got to stick to inflation. It was that the year before, 2011-2012, you see that rent just jumped. They just went from £98 to £121 a week. 2013 was more of a rebalancing rather than a kind of decision to rise in line with inflation. And now I'm going to move on and look at the number of rooms and the different types of services that are available, and a kind of, just a general profile of the sector. The Accommodation Costs Survey made clear a new trend in the sector, which is a massive growth in private providers in purpose-built student accommodation. And this chart shows how that nearly all of the 14% growth in the sector is being driven by private providers, who last year alone grew by 42%. So a sector which is growing, but growth is being driven by private providers because institutions are only growing by about 1%. All private providers are looking to make much more money and much greater profits from their accommodation compared to institutions. They are a purely private business. So they are, rather than offering pastoral care for students, they are offering profits for stakeholders. So rooms from private providers are much more expensive than those offered by an institution. And the Accommodation Costs Survey, you might have seen in the earlier slide, noted that rooms offered by private providers are on average 26% more expensive than institution rooms. So the growth of private providers means in real terms a growth in the most expensive sector, the most expensive part of the accommodation sector. And given the impact of uncapping student numbers at universities, so there's a greater demand for accommodation, this is having a substantial impact on the balance of affordable accommodation for students. So more students need accommodation. The bit of the sector that's growing the most is the most expensive part of the sector, which means proportionally the level of affordable accommodation is shrinking as the sector grows. Private, who I've mentioned, they are owned by holders. They are looking to make a profit. They tend to build accommodation that is going to attract a higher level of rent. So they are building certain types of accommodation, and these tend to be the sort of luxury offerings like studio flats. And you can see this be demonstrated in this chart. So you can see that catering en suites and sub-catering standards remain the biggest areas, and they are growing steadily, although not very quickly. But if you look at studio flats, woo, I'm going to highlight that there for you, and you can see that studio flats have actually grown 8% in the in the last year. So their growth is really significant, and that growth is being driven by private providers who are building these kind of luxury offerings for students, and so then charge the most rent for them. In the sector is not being distributed evenly across the UK. So you can see London, which is arguably where the most profit can be made by private providers, is growing quickly. So in London, there's been a 44% increase in bed spaces in 1 year alone. That's because in London, the baseline rent that you would expect to pay if you lived in a rented house or something is much higher. And that means that comparatively, private accommodation providers can increase their rents because they can look at a market average and say it's really, really high. So they're quite keen to build in London. But if you look at places like Yorkshire, the North East, where the baseline rent is lower, so the rent in the private rental sector is reasonably affordable in the North East in Yorkshire. So accommodation providers can't charge massive rents for luxury properties there because students have just moved to the private rented sector. So there's less development. So there is growth happening. There's huge growth, but it's being concentrated in high cost areas. And it's talking to the issue that this isn't really about what students need. It's not about matching where there's a growth in student numbers. It's about making a profit. Look at what sort of provision is made for students who have additional needs. So that includes students who have dependents or students that require adapted accommodation. Institutions provide a much better choice of services for student parents than private providers. And on average, institutions provided more than 120 rooms that were catered to families per institution, compared to just 9 rooms per private provider. So you can see that institutions are giving more rooms to more students with families. How easily rooms could be adapted for any of the following situations, including emergency accommodation, refuge accommodation, and rooms that could be quickly adapted for a disabled student. And again, institutions came out as much more adaptable, prepared for dealing with these situations compared to private providers. And that's what we're showing in this slide here. More detail about the adaptability of accommodation for disabled students. In Spain, are much better able to provide services compared to private providers, and in particular that's for students with for wheelchairs or ambulatory needs, but also students who are blind or students who are deaf. And on average, institutions can provide 111 rooms, which would be suitable for students with a visual impairment, whereas private providers could only provide 2 rooms on average to meet this need. I should confess, there's 3 slides missing in this presentation, and I don't know where they've gone. They had more detail about adaptations suitable for students with disabilities. So after this session, I will send you all a copy of the slides which have that full detail in, so you can see for yourself the difference in the provision there. So now to the end of the findings section of this presentation, we can take a look at how rent is set, and looking specifically at institutions here, because institutions and the way they set their rent should have a greater bearing on students, because of that kind of institution-student relationship, which is perhaps missing from private providers who are just, a service provider without the sort of implication of the institution. So this showing responses to the question that we asked, which was about how best describes the way your organisation determines the cost of your accommodation, the rent that you set. And for me, this is really interesting because if you look at the most popular answer about how do you set your rent, 16% of institutions said that they set their rent in comparison with other accommodation providers. It's not about how much it costs to accommodation. It's not about how much students can afford to pay for the accommodation. It's about what other people are charging for their accommodation. And I think we'd probably take issue with that, because that's not, that's just relying on market forces. And if all the other accommodation providers in the area are private providers, you can all get this like false race to the top where prices just escalate because everyone is setting them and guessing with each other without sort of accounting for any other aspects like affordability or cost. Reassuringly, 63% of organisations set their rent based on what it costs to actually run the accommodation, which is great. But then it just sort of gets into quite an alarming, funny picture after that. So consultation with students' unions, only 29% of institutions consulted with their students' union when they decided to set their rent. Other options for setting rent, things like inflation, which we talked about earlier, things like tuition fee increases, so how much money a student's likely to actually have, and agreements with private providers. So some institutions have outsourced all of their accommodation to private providers, but because they use a nomination agreement, they almost act as if they were the provider of the accommodation. And for the purposes of the Accommodation Costs Survey, where institutions have a nominations agreement with a private provider, that's counted as if it were institution accommodation. And that's a note that when we're talking about private providers, we are talking about private providers who don't have that relationship with an institution. Moving to who sets the rent, I thought this was quite an interesting finding as well, because setting the rent really should be a sort of financial decision, because it's about costs and, meeting your costs and those things. So it would make sense that it would be the Director of Finance or even the Director of Properties and Facilities Management who would make those decisions about setting the rent. What surprised me here was that in 23% of institutions, the Vice-Chancellor set the rent. And I'm not sure about how that relationship works in terms of a financial decision based on running costs if it's decided by the Vice-Chancellor. When it comes to connecting with students' unions or even any kind of student representation in setting the rent, it really is quite a poor show. So this slide shows the answer to the question, to what extent, if at all, is the student union involved in setting the rent? And so you can see that 29% of institutions, 28% positively engage with their students' union when they're making their decision on rent. But 8% only somewhat involve the students' union, and really alarmingly, only 54% don't involve the students' union at all when it comes to rent setting decisions. And this on likely to talk about how students' unions are consulted generally about decisions that are made in the accommodation. So from this chart is that when it comes to things like environmental initiatives and residential life activities, the student union is consulted quite positively. So, in 95% of cases, the student union is consulted on environmental issues. The thing to hear is that environmental issues are about reducing energy use, which is brilliant, but it's also about reducing a cost for the institution, because if they use less power, then it costs them less in their electricity bill. So it's in the institution's interest to involve students' unions in this kind of cost-saving activity. Similar residential life activities, these are marketed to students, they're charged for, they're part of the draw factor to attract new students. So again, it's in the university's interest to involve students' union in these decisions. However, when it comes to anything that has a cost implication for the institution, we see that students' unions are consulted in to a degree. So planning for future development, where students' union will be able to advise you on things like type of accommodation do students really need. Students want to live in luxury studio apartments, or are there a significant number of students who actually don't mind sharing a bathroom, don't mind sharing a kitchen, and you just want kind of standard self-catering. And also rent setting. So we talked about that previously, that rent setting really is good when it comes to consultation with the students' union. Moving on now again, a particular issue that we have with accommodation providers is charging of unnecessary or higher fees. And these include things like cancellation fees, but they extend to practices like asking for deposits, which are often asked for before the student loan comes in, or insisting that students use guarantors if they can't pay the rent in one lump sum up front. So, to talk about guarantors, 17% of institutions require students to provide a guarantor before they could move into a room. A guarantor is someone who, usually a family member, who agrees to be liable for any rent that isn't paid. So if a tenant can't pay their rent, the landlord can go to the guarantor and ask them for that money, and it's a legally binding agreement. So in 17% of cases, institutions required students to have a guarantor. For providers, this figure was much, much higher at 65%. Institutions largely got around the problem of needing a guarantor by asking prospective tenants to demonstrate that they had a proof of income, so that they could prove that once their student loan came in, they were going to be able to pay the rent. But private providers, they didn't do that. Private providers were much more likely to demand a guarantor, and especially in circumstances where the student was paying the rent in instalments rather than in an upfront lump sum. For guarantors, and especially in circumstances where the student can't pay all of their rent in one lump sum, and just a reminder, a lump sum of rent could be anything from £4,000 to £6,000, really unfairly discriminates against students who don't have ready access to the amount of cash. And these are students who are least likely to be able to provide a guarantor. So if you don't have a massive amount of cash up front before your student loan comes in, you're more likely to be a working class student. You might be estranged from your family. You might be a care leaver. And so those people as well are much less likely to be able to provide a guarantor. I know that those kind of issues, those kind of barriers do put off students from those backgrounds from a university, because if you can't get your accommodation, you can't attend. Unsurprisingly, institutions were much more likely to offer financial support for tenants who were struggling to pay their rent, struggling to find a guarantor, that kind of thing. So 70% of institutions provided financial support for people living in their accommodation. The support offered by institutions came in the form of things like bursaries, widening participation scholarships for students from participation backgrounds get help paying the rent, and also systems of grants and loans for people experiencing hardship. 11% of private providers offered any kind of financial support for students that were struggling, and largely this came in the form of like fee waivers. So the fees that they charged, the upfront fees, be waived if a student was experiencing financial difficulty. I think what's really interesting is about the compounding or the combination of asking for money up front. So private providers were more likely to request both a deposit and payment of rent in advance. Again, if you don't have that access to money, if you don't have that ready cash before your student loan comes in, and you're not able to afford to live in private accommodation. And it's kind of like a double whammy for students, which is very likely to have them enter into debt if trying to secure their accommodation, which is certainly not a situation that is so like to encourage. The research itself, and I should say the Accommodation Costs Survey is absolutely huge. It's a really long document. It's full of detail, it's full of finding, it's full of comment, and I really would urge you to take a look through it, read through it. If you have any specific sort of comments, do ask me. You can email me, and I'll have a look and see if I can draw out any other findings from the raw data, because we have this massive data set, and it takes us all year to write a full report of all of the data, so we just pick out the best bits. But it's a really valuable resource, and there's loads in there. So yeah, that's the research itself, and I'm going to go on now and talk about some of the conclusions that we drew based on that research. It's around affordability. An affordable accommodation is something that we recommend every time we publish the Accommodation Cost Survey, because students need affordable accommodation, and in particular, students who are coming from low-income backgrounds need access to affordable accommodation so they can attend university. However, 48% of institutions and 46% of private providers didn't recognise that they needed to have a policy on affordable accommodation. As I mentioned, overall weekly rent rose well above RPI in some cases, and average accommodation costs to live purpose-built student accommodation equates to 85% of the maximum student finance available for 2015-16. So students are only left with, I think it's £800 to live on for the rest of the year once you take out their accommodation costs. And £800, that's like 20 quid a week to live on, to get your food, to get course materials and clothes you might need. So it's kind of, the accommodation costs are saying that without family support or without taking on a part-time job, you have an accommodation. So is moving away from low-cost, self-catering, non-ensuite rooms, which were always, you know, the more affordable side of the market, towards these luxury rooms and studios. And there's kind of this narrative that, like, students want luxury, students want, you know, they want gyms in their accommodation, they want cinemas, they want the bathroom, and we've not seen any evidence to point to that. There will always be students who want that luxury product, but there are also students who need the affordable product, and that affordable product is being squeezed out, and it's reducing the overall availability of affordable accommodation for students. And then finally, on affordability, the market is being driven by private providers who are interested in their yields, and it's not being driven by what consumers, which is an awful term, but in this sense, consumers are students. So it isn't being driven by what students need, it's being driven by what private providers can money for, and that's affecting affordability as well. Things around marketisation, so higher housing costs are pushing students into debt. And for 2016, grants are going to be slashed. They're going to get got rid of for students and replaced with enhanced loans. What these enhanced loans, and I'm doing my little, you know, air quotes, which you can't see, but I hope you can hear. What enhanced loans are going to mean is that students at 40% lowest background, are to be left leaving university with a debt of around £53,000. So whereas grants could meet some of those costs, could meet their living costs, now they're gone and it's loans. And so students are going to be facing choices based on, well, this is my debt, this is my money, what's my best value for money? Is it this ludicrously expensive student accommodation, or is it a room in a shared house in the private sector? But we know that massive amounts of debt from our study debt in the first degree, we know that debt adversely affects students, specifically from BME households or black students, and also students from lower income households because of their aversion to debt. We that 1 in 20 students told us that they would not come to university because of the debt if they had their time again. And students who had much lower levels of debt before this £53,000 came in. Students are going to have their own money, their own debt, will act more as consumers. And what that means is that, you know, the market force of these students, these consumers, is going to impact on high prices and poor offers, where students are going to be much more dispersed, much more disparate group. They're not all going to be in these high-rise tower blocks, these purpose-built student accommodation. They're going to be in the private rental sector or the city. It's going to have implications for all sorts of planning and local authority decisions. Once to the Accommodation Costs Survey, we also made a series of recommendations. These are just some of them. This recommendation is what was passed national conference last year, and that is that accommodation should be affordable, and affordability policies should institutions. Part of that affordability policy should be that 25% of all bed spaces offered by institutions should be charged at 50% of the maximum loan or grant, so that students aren't faced with it 85% of their grant is 50%, leaving them 50% to live on and meet their course costs or their living costs. Booking fees should only be charged at a rate which is the actual administration cost to the organisation if a student were to cancel or a student is booking their accommodation. They shouldn't be used as an additional way to generate income. All should consult with their students' union or their students' association in Scotland on rent setting and planning. So unions are the authority on students, and they should be consulted when it comes to, you know, what their students want in terms of new rooms, and what could their students afford in terms of new rooms. And students' associations should be consulted with planning agreements with local authorities. should be offered to students to use energy carefully. Absolutely, it's really important that we're all sort of aware of the energy that we're using and we try and reduce it. But tenants or students living in purpose-built student accommodation should have any rebate paid back to them. So if they contribute to activity which save an institution money, they should get a rebate from the cost that they saved. That's only fair, and it would happen if you were living in the private rented sector and you paid too much for your electricity. Has brought me to the end of my presentation about the research and the findings and the conclusions and the recommendations. Thank you very much for listening. So now this is sort of your opportunity to ask me any questions or post any comments that you might have in response to the survey. We can do that via the chat box, which is here on the right hand side of the screen. You can just type in your question, or you can raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, I will unmute you and you can ask your question direct to everyone else. The way that you raise your hand is the little icon on the bit where the participants in the chat box is. It's like a hand, it's got a little blue collar. So if you click on that, it says raise your hand and I will unmute you and you can ask your question then. You can put it in the box. I'm just going to see if anyone. Ooh. So when is the next round of the survey being launched? So we do the survey every 2 or 3 years. So we've just done the one for 2015-16. So the next one will be 2018. And what's really interesting about that is actually we're predicting some kind of interesting results to come out in 2018. The growth of the private sector at the moment, if that's continued, we expect the Accommodation Costs Survey to start changing and the figures are going to start getting kind of weird because the impact of the private sector is just going to push those prices up so high. I think they're going to be the majority provider by 2018. So it's going to be exciting to see how that trend maps out. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions and I'm not seeing anyone who's raised a hand. If you want to ask me anything, now is the time, but if not, I just end and say thank you so much for listening. A copy of those can be sent out to you. We'll also put the recording up on Connect if you want to listen again. I don't know yet, but you might do. And also I'll send you a link to the Accommodation Costs Survey itself so you can have a look and have a read through. But yeah, thank you so much for listening and have a nice afternoon and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.